under 3 weeks, 1,499 names were gathered by a small committee of women. This petition was presented to John Stuart Mill by Elizabeth Garrett and Emily Davis. Those women who were interested in suffrage then went and created different suffrage societies. By 1897, there had been so many suffrage petitions to Parliament that there needed to be some coordination. So they founded the National Union of Women's Suffrage Societies, and Millicent Garrett Fawcett led this group, and she became its president formally in 1907. The WSPU was the Women's Social and Political Union. It was founded in Manchester in 1903 by Emmeline Pankhurst. The motto of the WSPU was deeds, not words, and they started their campaign really by heckling at political meetings. And in 1905 you get the first case of where the heckling ends up with imprisonment, and Christabel Pankhurst and Annie Kenny were arrested, which led to them being imprisoned, and that was the first case of militancy. Emmeline Pethick Lawrence and Frederick provided the money for the campaign. They also co-edited and ran the Votes for Women, the newspaper for the Women's Social and Political Union.
LSE was always an institution that was open to women. The prospectus says that the school should be available to anybody who can take advantage of its courses and its support, and it specifically says both men and women. The suffrage movement and LSE were moving in the same geography and in the same spaces. The WSPU's office was in Clement's Inn and close to the Fabian Society offices, which were very closely linked to the school. Opposite LSE on Clare Market was the St Clement's Press, well known for printing the Financial Times, but it also printed Votes for Women. Round on what's now 20 Kingsway, there was the Teacup Inn, which was known as a suffragette tea rooms. The London Opera House sat on the corner of Portugal Street in Kingsway, and there were several suffrage meetings there.
When the WSPU moves to London in 1906, the campaign becomes very public. So you get demonstrations, or processions as they were known. Actually, the National Union of Women's Suffrage Societies was the first organisation that had a big procession in London on the 13th of June 1908, and then the WSPU follow it a week later.
It would have been extremely difficult, I think, for people who either studied or worked at LSE not to know about it. We know that Eileen Power, who from 1931 was LSE's second woman professor in economic history, she worked for the National Union of Women's Suffrage Societies. One of the students, Alice Clark, who in 1914 got the Charlotte Shaw Research Studentship, she was also very active in the NUWSS and an active campaigner for women's suffrage. And I think it's true also to say that even women who were perhaps not actively involved in the suffrage movement, I mean people like Lillian Knowles or even Beatrice Webb, they had a keen interest in things like women's work, employment, equal pay. So women's issues were kind of part of the agenda.
After Black Friday and the violence that was shown towards women, the campaign becomes more serious in the terms of the militancy. So stone throwing starts then, and window smashing, and a big window smashing campaign was in 1912. You get pillar boxes being fired and artworks being destroyed in the National Gallery. So the escalation of violence had increased significantly, and then you get the war. Officially, the campaign for women's suffrage was suspended by the National Union of Women's Suffrage Societies and by the Women's Social and Political Union. But in reality, Millicent Garrett Fawcett keeps lobbying, Parliament, and then you get a speakers' conference where they are discussing reforms to the electoral register, because most of the men who were serving in the First World War didn't have the vote. So in this speakers' conference, if there was going to be any electoral change, they wanted women to be considered. It wasn't universal suffrage, it was suffrage for women who were over the age of 30 who had a property qualification, or were married to a man who had the right property qualification, and to women who had a degree. The campaign for women's suffrage didn't stop in 1918, it continued for another 10 years. And the London Society for Women's Suffrage, it changed its name to the London Society for Women's Service, and it campaigned until 1928 to bring about the Equal Franchise Act, and that is when women got equal voting rights with men.
The legacy of the suffrage movement continues on at LSE today. In November 2018, we named 3 of our buildings after 3 women whose work helped achieve the first votes for women in 1918. The plaque on the left commemorates the work of the Women's Social and Political Union, who are based here at Clements Inn. Our buildings on this site are now named after 2 of their leaders, suffragettes Emmeline Pankhurst and Emmeline Pethwick Lawrence. A 3rd building on this site is named for suffragist Millicent Fawcett, whose archive we hold. We are the custodian of the Women's Library, the foremost collection of original material on women's suffrage in the country, open to all students and researchers.
It's globally a unique collection. I think what makes the LSE an absolutely excellent place for this collection to be housed is so much of this collection is about the ways in which women became part of the welfare state. It's not just that the women who are part of the Women's Library were the pioneers of social work, social policy, economics, economic history, etc., which they were. But actually, it's that women were also part of the ways in which ideas were constructed in terms of the rights that citizens should have, the kinds of access that women should have to political and other institutions.
There are a lot of synergies with the Women's Library collections and our own special collections at LSE in the social sciences. So we've really been able to bring lots of different materials together to tell a bigger story. I think preserving collections is so important because it provides a record of people's lives. So these are primary source material. And so it really gives a voice to people, and with the Women's Library, particularly women who are often underrepresented in narratives. And so it means that people can speak from the past. We learn about what it was like at the time, but it also helps us to understand where we are now and where we might want to be in the future.
The plaque on the right serves as a permanent reminder of our connection to the legacy of the suffrage campaign. Students recreated the March of the Suffragettes, and we welcomed Her Royal Highness the Countess of Wessex to campus to rename the buildings. She, Helen Pankhurst, and Caroline Criado Perez helped us to both celebrate the centenary year of the first votes for women and signal our ongoing commitment to gender equality and social progress.
Women have been written out of history for far too long, and there is so much evidence showing that this has a huge impact on young girls and what they believe that they can do, what they believe they can achieve.
Women and girls today need that inspiration, they need that leadership, they need to know that it's possible to drive change and to be the people who shape the world and shape the future.
I think commemorating the suffragettes is hugely important because there is no democracy unless everyone in that country has access to voting for the people that govern them. Commemorating that agency, that sense, not just of getting women the vote, but the implications of women having the vote. This is foundational to the very idea of democracy.
I think it's important that institutions and people have a memory of the history of how things came about. And I think doing something as simple as renaming the towers after these women is a way of embedding a memory of that campaign into hopefully not just the consciousness of LSE students and staff and alumni, but also everybody who walks through Clement's Inn.
Millicent Garrett Fawcett, she had witnessed the campaign for women's suffrage from 1866 to 1928, and she produced this leaflet in July 1928. And she says, "Our own cause is a long way from full success. Women's political equality is achieved, but their moral and economic equality are still to be won, and we must not let our energy die away because we have won in the first great victory."